Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in and welcome to the next part of our Leap Texas conference webinar series. We have a great presentation today being given by Karen at Texas Southmost College and John and Matt with Vantage Learning McCann Associates. I thank you all for tuning in. I encourage you to check out, of course, this presentation and the others that we still have coming. Registration links for those are up on the Leap Texas website. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Karen and mute myself and let them take over. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. This is Dr. White-Gorzweta. I'm the Director of Curriculum and Assessment at Texas Southmost College, and it's a privilege to have the time to speak with everyone and discuss some work that we've been doing here at Texas Southmost College in collaboration with Vantage Learning and McCann Associates, using the value rubrics, two of them, communication and critical thinking, to assess student work and aligning it with Vantage Learning and McCann Associates AI system. And so I would like to go ahead and introduce Mr. John Burke, and he can introduce himself, and Mr. Matt Daniker.
Thank you, Dr. White-Gorzweta. My name is John Burke at Vantage Learning, and the agenda today will follow in order kind of an overall introduction to Telemetric, the history of writing and how artificial intelligence has been applied to both formative and summative assessment, understanding how Telemetric works, and then we'll get into the specifics, and Dr. White-Gorzweta will lead that about what we actually did with TSM and the essay scoring project, and then get into both the assessment and the instructional application of Telemetric as well. Next. So Telemetric was introduced in 1998 by Vantage Learning as the first commercially available technology to score writing automatically, and to do it more consistently and reliably and very much faster, obviously, than expert human scorers. And Telemetric's had a lot of different applications over the years. The GMAT, for example, uses it to score writing assessments, and one of the studies we'll include at the end is a very recent efficacy study that GMAT published about Telemetric. And educational partners like McGraw-Hill embed and license the technology within something called MH Connect. And while Vantage is not a household name, we're only a couple of hundred people here in New Hope, Pennsylvania. Our technology has a global footprint. Over the last 2 decades, we've developed more than 40 natural language understanding and linguistic patents that are applied in very broadly used technologies like Microsoft Word. Grammar spell check is a Vantage patent, and if any of you have an iPhone, you'll find 17 of our patents embedded. It's called IntelliWriter, and it's basically around the autofill and autocorrect text functionality in your iPhone. But Telemetric has been applied for this study, and also is applied to instructional applications as well. Next. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Daniker. He'll talk to you a little bit about how Telemetric scores papers.
Thanks, John. My name's Matt Daniker, and I've been with Vantage Learning for about 16 years now, working with Telemetric and other technologies. So how does Telemetric work? I was on a call earlier today, and the answer to that question was, well, it's magic. And while that's a romantic notion, in fact, the way Telemetric, which is the name of our artificial intelligence, looks at essays is kind of similar in some ways to the way humans look at essays. So I'm not going to read the slide here, but just sort of note the bullets, that the process by which Telemetric is trained is akin to how human experts train on scoring essays. Human experts will, review a rubric, they will do some test scoring, they'll collaborate, they'll draw anchors, and then ultimately they'll begin scoring, and they'll look for a certain amount of agreement between human experts. And Telemetric will do much the same. Now, it is a learning engine. So Telemetric doesn't have a native ability to score any old writing sample, but what it does have is the ability to be trained to score specific writing samples. So some of the technologies that underlie this are pattern matching. And pattern matching is really behind a lot of what artificial intelligence does. Right? If artificial intelligence, if Telemetric can begin to find patterns that are meaningful in human writing, patterns that would have certain meaning to expert human scorers, it can begin to sort of mimic the process, identify those patterns, and score as humans would. Now, one of the things that makes Telemetric so unique is that it does this through natural language processing. So ultimately, Telemetric sees reality, it sees writing, as a series of ones and zeros, as any computer sees any information. But it's able to sort of build context around the data by understanding natural language. So the fact that our technologies can do things like autocorrect, correct grammar, correct your text messages, the fact that we understand the context around writing, we can use that then to understand writing for the purpose of scoring it, of evaluating it. So what Telemetric will do essentially is it converts writing, into zeros and ones and begins looking for certain characteristics of writing. Next slide, please. So if that first slide then was sort of a bird's eye view of the process, this is a little bit more about the actual nuts and bolts. So the way that we actually go about creating Telemetric scoring models is we sort of feed into Telemetric a set of essays that we would call a training set. And this set of essays will have been scored by one or more humans. It may also be chiefed, for perfection, for expert scoring. And the text will be processed. So it'll be converted into a form that the computer can understand. And then the computer Telemetric will begin to parse it, to begin to understand how sentences are created, how the words within sentences relate to one another, how the sentences then relate to each other, how the sentences build paragraphs, how the paragraphs relate. And then you get kind of into the middle of the screen where the computational analysis begins. Once Telemetric has taken the writing apart essentially and begins to understand what the words mean, it can then apply value to it. So it'll look at things like vocabulary to understand concepts. And it will use a neural type network then to link those concepts to begin to understand ideas. Now you see flowing out of this computational analysis then, you'll have multiple judges. And this is one of the things that makes Telemetric unique. We don't just sort of base our scoring on one approach to AI scoring. There are, after all, many different ways that it can be approached. What we do is we actually have multiple judges in the system that will produce multiple outcomes. In other words, multiple ways of scoring an individual essay. What we then do with those multiple approaches is we optimize them. And we look for the single best approach to scoring essays. That approach that will come closest to the humans who scored the originals. Out of that then becomes a final Telemetric score for an essay, as well as what we refer to as an Telemetric scoring model, which is a set of instructions that can be applied to score that writing consistently and reliably and quickly over and over and over. Next slide, please.
So this is Dr. White-Roswell again, and I want to explain why we decided to go with this pilot and look at how AI and the value rubrics can be used to actually score essays for completed work at the end of a course. Basically, as the assessment director here at Texas Southmost College, what I was noticing and observing is that the faculty appeared to still be using somewhat of a more subjective way of scoring, and that is understood. but we want to get to the point in assessment that we are more objective and we're actually using the rubrics appropriately. So what I did is I met with the individuals with AI, with the Vantage, and we decided to look at how the AI system and telemetrics could be used to not only score communications, which is a similar criteria to what is scored on written papers, but also to look at critical thinking. And if we could find that the AI was objectively scoring the essays, the completed student work, close to or at least within a standard deviation of the scores for the faculty, as well as the calibration scores when all the faculty come together to score a piece of work, that this might be a way to then align the AI system into the Canvas and have it provide feedback to the student on a regular basis, and hopefully improve their ability to write, which is related to communication, and also use good processing and logical reasoning for critical thinking. So what we did was I provided 1,000 essays of English 1301 and English 1302 completed student work at the end of the course. These student works were already scored by the faculty, and then it was also scored by a group of faculty together that I use calibration sessions to do. And there's about 8 to 10 raters for each piece of work, and they all come together in agreement and consensus in calibration to score the piece of work. And then I have an average for calibration, which is institutional level, and then I also have the scores for the faculty. So we pulled the scores from Canvas because now we have all signature assignments uploaded by the students into the Canvas courses. Even though we're not a fully online program for general studies, we do have all of our courses in Canvas and allow the students to submit their work to Canvas, and then I am able to pull the student learning outcomes report that provides the scores that the faculty gave the students on each piece of their work and each of these core objectives. And again, the calibration sessions are about 8 to 10 individual faculty members that come together to score using the critical thinking and communication rubrics of from value, which we have now adapted to our college. Then once I've done that, I provided these Excel sheets with the faculty scores to AI, to Vantage Learning. And then for each prompt, I believe the data was split into training and validation sets, which Matt or John will speak to in just a second. And then again, they were created in Telemetric Scoring model, which then showed us how the comparison of the AI scoring, the faculty scoring of the student work, and the institutional level scoring of the student work. So I will move on to talk about the rubric. Now we have the written communication value rubric adapted, as I mentioned. So if anyone doesn't know about AAC&U, which I'm sure that most participants do, but this is the value rubric for written communication that we use here to assess students' work for communication under the component of English 1301 and 1302 are under the communication component for Texas core curriculum. And then we also have the critical thinking value rubric, and these two value rubrics were provided to Vantage Learning so that they could do what they needed to do to calibrate AI to look at these criteria. John or Matt?
Hi, this is Matt Denneker again. I'll pick up from there. Thank you. So what we're presenting was some of the data. So the next couple of screens will show some of the data, the results of the modeling process. And without getting too lost in the data, it kind of looks at a couple of things. It looks at sort of where we came from, where we are today, and it begins to suggest where we might go tomorrow. So in this particular snippet from a spreadsheet, if you look at the very top, you'll see where we list the training score distribution, and you'll see a score from 1 to 5 and then a count. So the training set that we used to train in telemetric, it's important that in telemetric be trained with a normally distributed and well-scored set of essays with strong representation, especially at the tails, meaning a good representation of very poor scores and a good representation of very good scores. So in this particular distribution, you'll note that most of the responses are clustered around the 4 score point. So what that tells us is that much of what Telemetric learned was that results are going to be sort of clustered around the 4. So one of the areas then where we think we can improve the scoring is by coming up with a better distributed original training set here that has a fairer description, I think, of what it means to score low on the rubric. Now, that being said, in the middle of the table here, we then actually display the results from this initial scoring. Now, this is for the SLO 05, the communication rubric. And this specifically came from the 1301 group. So in the middle of the table here, we have validation statistics where we put together a confusion matrix. Now, what this does is it compares in this validation set of essays, it compares how the humans scored the writing to how the computer scored the writing. So we hold back about 50 of the original papers. We hold those back in order to validate the modeling process. So they're kept hidden from the humans, they're kept hidden from Telemetric, and they're scored blind here once the modeling process is complete. So what we're looking for is sort of a tight grouping around those sort of blue stair steps that you see within the graph. In that case, then, where the computer scored a 1, the human would score a 1, and so on. So you'll notice that there's not a lot of representation of essays toward the bottom of this scale, because there really weren't a lot of 1s or 2s or 3s or even 5s included in this set. But you'll notice that when we get to the point where the computer is scoring a 4 versus the human scores, we begin to see representation in the graph. Now, below that, we compare the means, and very often, Telemetric means are a little bit higher than the human means. But one of the things that makes the AI scoring valuable is that the standard deviation tends to be smaller. So in this case, you'll notice that the human and the computer means were both about right on the same level, which is a 4, which is what we'd expect from the initial training set. But then you'll notice the tightness of the standard deviation. And that just sort of indicates how the artificial intelligence can score time and time and time again reliably without any of the biases that might increase the standard deviation. Finally, then, we reproduce an exact, adjacent, and discrepant count to show how often Telemetric matched the human scores versus was adjacent to it. And in this case, we were pretty tight. So we were at about a 76% exact match on the human scores. And that's kind of where we are today. So the scoring in this case was pretty strong, but we think it could be improved both by looking at sort of the initial distribution in the training set. But if we look at that little yellow box now at the bottom of the graph, what that compares is the human mean to the Telemetric mean to the calibration mean. Now, the calibration mean are the scores that were produced by the expert humans who reviewed the scores from the classroom instructors, I believe. Seeing that that calibration mean is a little bit lower suggests to us that the expert humans disagreed a little bit with the instructors. And because Telemetric was trained based on the instructors, it would disagree a little bit with Telemetric. So we think in the future, by creating these models using not necessarily the instructor scores, but rather the more highly calibrated scores, we could reach even higher levels of accuracy in the scoring. Next slide, please.
And before you go on, Matt, just to make sure that I answered a question, it was asked, you know, how many student work do we look at? And so at the course level in Canvas, remember that all of the students are submitting their work in English 1301 or English 1302. And so therefore that human mean that you see is related to all of the scores that the faculty provided on every single student for communication and critical thinking related to the essay. And then at the calibration, cal mean score is when all of the faculty came together. We do 10% of the essays that were used for the faculty to score. We pull 10% of those student work, same student work, and we have the interators calibrate on that student work. So it's about 10%. Now for John or Matt, there is a question that says, we have an English faculty member with a dissertation related to student assessment who is very opposed to AI. Can you speak to the advances that have occurred in the last few years that would dispel his concerns?
Yeah, I think this is John. You know, I had sent, and we will provide a recent graduate management admissions council, you know, the purveyors of the GMAT who use this to score the GMAT writing assessment. It was a rather expansive study on AI, and we understand that human scores may have some skepticism about it, but the research is detailed. Probably doesn't do to go into it here, but we will provide it at the conclusion of this for everyone to see. And you know, AI, like any other technology, it continues to evolve. But you know, the high stakes testing administrators trust it, and that's I think telling. And it's research that was not sponsored or subsidized by us in any way. This comes from GMAT, and hopefully it will answer some of those concerns.
Okay, great. And Matt, if you'd like to explain this slide and show what
Sure.
the number again is, because we need, someone stated that we needed an input in there. So if you'll show them where the number of student works was calibrated.
Okay, so these two screens here now show the results for the other learning outcomes, the SLO-02 and the SLO-04, which are both related to the critical thinking rubric. So you'll notice again the training score distributions. Again, the training score distributions were a little bit light at the lower end, and which is not necessarily unusual. When students are turning in high stakes assessments, we very often see, you know, sort of lower contributions at the lower end, although that can be remedied over time. So the N, the number of submissions, would be the sum of that first row. So I don't have the N off the top of my head here, but we could supply that. But it would be the sum of that first row. Ooh,
Okay.
I'm sorry. Just
the sum of the first row. Mm-hmm.
So within the confusion matrices, again, we'll see again how tightly the telemetric scoring, the computer scoring will sort of wrap around that blue stair step. And we'll notice then that the human means and the computer means, again, are very, very close. So in telemetric is scoring, you know, in a way that's very similar to the humans. But you'll notice in this case, because we have a little bit of a greater distribution in the scores, the standard deviations are greater, but again, the computer standard deviation is tighter. So in telemetric is going to score about the way the humans do, but just in sort of a bit of a tighter range. Now the exact and the adjacent numbers for the critical thinking score points here, they vary a little bit more than the the first set of data that we shared. So in this case, you'll see there are actually some discrepancies that show up. And one of the ways that we can kind of begin to look at this and see what those discrepancies mean, what the data here will show is that IntelliMetric is differing from the underlying humans, but it isn't able to tell us, for example, whether the original humans were right or whether IntelliMetric was right. So what we'll often do is look at those discrepant responses and have a calibrator, have an expert human review them to make that determination. So what we're seeing here is a little bit more variety in the scoring. So we see some deviation from the humans, but what that deviation means would take a little bit more research. Again, you'll notice that in the yellow box that the human and the computer means are very close, but differ from the calibration mean, which again suggests work that we might be able to do in the future with the calibrated humans. Next slide, please. So again, not to get too wrapped up in all the data, but we posted some further results here. The initial results that we shared were part of the modeling process, where we took a training set and we took a separate set of validation essays and compared that data. These further results then were just the scoring of a fresh set of responses. So again, we'll produce the confusion matrices, the exact adjacent counts, and the averages. And you'll notice again that the metrics are all fairly close. So next slide, please.
Okay, and before I go on, Dr. Roberts said, have y'all looked at inter-rater reliability statistics between the human and AI scores for the same artifact? A high rate of inter-rater reliability would speak to agreement between the human and AI scores. And I believe that that's what Matt is getting at, is that the next time we're going to look at the inter-rater, which is the calibration, we're going to look at that to train AI. Is that correct, Matt?
Yeah, so what these results will show you is how close IntelliMetric was to the original humans. We don't have information yet on how the calibration, the chiefs, the experts, where they fit into the process. One thing that can help us understand is how accurate the original humans were. So that is a future area for study.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So here we just, so Sarah's question about how to calculate the discrepant. A discrepant is where the computer and the human disagree by more than a point. So here we share then the results of the modeling process for 1302. So the data is similar. We used a similar separation of a training set and a validation set. So here we're reporting on the validation. You'll notice again that the human means and the computer means are close, and the standard deviation is about half that for the computer scoring. In the yellow box, again, we'll see that the calibration mean is a little bit lower, right? So the expert humans tend to score these responses a little bit lower than the original humans did, which then means that they'll be a little bit lower than the IntelliMetric scores. And that may actually get back to the whole notion of reliability. Teachers can be influenced when they score these responses based on their interactions with the students, whether they like the students or don't like the students, or feel positive about the class, don't feel positive about the class, or there's so many different factors that can affect those original instructors that the blind calibration scoring is probably closer to what we would consider the true score. And ultimately, that's where IntelliMetric wants to be as well.
And I agree. I agree. That's again the reason why I decided to do this with IntelliMetric, because I could observe when I'm pulling the student artifacts, when I'm pulling the student learning outcomes, when I'm doing the calibration sessions, that there appears to be some level of bias in the score of the faculty member versus when all of us came together as at the institutional level. So this is the number one reason why this pilot began in the first place. Okay, next.
So this is the 1302 results for the SLO-02 and the SLO-03, both critical thinking scores. Again, you'll notice that our initial training distributions, while a little bit better represented at the high end, we're still light on the low end. Again, it's not unusual. There's not a lot of samples of genuinely poor student writing. But the averages were close. And again, we see the computer with standard deviations that are much tighter than the human deviations. And you'll notice that the exact and the adjacent percents at the bottom of the display, that Telemetric matches the initial humans about more than half of the time and is adjacent or next to the human scores just about the rest of the time, with just a minor number of discrepants that come in. Those discrepants are usually the best essays to go back and look at in order to figure out who actually is correct. Even though it's discrepant, we often find that Telemetric is providing a better score on those than the underlying humans. Next slide, please. And then for 1302, we did another set of results, which again sort of validates that underlying model performance. So we're looking at exact percentages here closer to 60% in the case of SLO2 and 3. Learning outcome 4 is a little bit below 50%, but between exact and adjacent, we're nearly 100% with just a minor number of discrepants that come through. Averages, again, are very close, standard deviations being tighter. So I ran through that data pretty quickly. If there are any other questions about the data specifically, you can put that into the chat. This was just the very first initial modeling run. Normally what we do within Telemetric is we'll work through different kinds of processes to improve the agreement, which usually involves going back and having humans do additional scoring and things along those lines. That we have not yet done for this data, but would like to do that going forward. Next slide, please. So why is Telemetric then so useful as a scoring tool? Now, I do a lot of essay scoring, human scoring as part of my job, and have over the years. And humans certainly are subject to biases that can affect the accuracy of the scoring, but oftentimes that's not the most important reason that we see for using an AI approach to scoring. Oftentimes, when we apply Telemetric scoring, students are able to write more and more frequently than they can when they're waiting for human scores. So what we display here is just some information that we've developed from some of the writing that we score in our other computer applications across different genres of writing, such as informative, literary, narrative, and persuasive. So part of what we do is we try to enable students to write more frequently, get more instantaneous feedback, so that their process doesn't have to wait for the humans who are doing the evaluation. So our agreement rates within Telemetrics and human in most of these applications will come closer to about 70 to 80% or even higher exact scoring, with the residual number of essays being adjacently scored. So Telemetric then will agree often enough with humans to be accurate across grade levels, across genres, and across contexts, from high stakes to low stakes, from thesis sort of length writing to short answer writing. There was a comment in the chat about MOOCs, and we actually do some scoring. We can't tell you for whom, but we do scoring for certain MOOCs where we'll score hundreds and hundreds of thousands of 1 and 2 and 3 sentence responses. So that kind of production simply isn't possible with humans or an army of TAs. So in Telemetric, we'll score these responses faster, more reliably, and consistently, always applying the same rules. Now, where in Telemetric sometimes needs a little help is with the essays that are a bit more unusual, sort of outliers, creative responses, atypical responses, unusual responses. So as part of the training process, we often work with that kind of material as well. One of the ways we've used in Telemetric, for example, in a K-12 context is through a technology we call ViAlert, which scans writing for the unique kind of messages that students will sometimes include that might suggest harm to themselves or others. And we're able then to alert authorities that piece of writing might need to be looked at by someone who knows the student. And interestingly enough, part of the way that we tested that technology was by comparing normal student samples to student samples that are written about, like Hamlet, for example. So if you're writing about a play which is full of violence, how can we sort of separate real violence from fictional violence? And Telemetric is pretty good at doing that. Next slide, please.
Okay, and there's a question from Sarah that asks, what is training score distribution?
So the training score distribution is the distribution of human scores that are given to the initial set of essays that we use to train in Telemetric. So we'll take a set of essays, maybe 500 or 600, and we'll want those normally distributed across whatever the score scale is. So in this case, the score scale ranged from 1 to 5. We would expect to see a normal distribution from 1 to 5. And that is our training score distribution. So just one more slide for me then to kind of wrap up what I was saying about Telemetric. Telemetric is not the only technology that scores writing nowadays. There are other folks who try to do it. But one of the things that makes Telemetric unique is just sort of the number of features that we use and we apply to the writing. Since we hold some of the original patents for grammar checking, spell checking, heuristics of that nature, we can really understand the language, I think, better than most. And then connect it to a more neurosynthetic type approach where we're looking at how concepts then connect. So we can determine when writing is on topic or off topic. It is systemic, so that it's the same process over and again. Inductive in that it learns from the humans. It's not replacing humans. It takes its cue from the humans. And we do apply multiple judgments to find that single best outcome, that single best solution for that particular piece of writing. So I think that's all I had to say about Telemetric. Be happy to answer any other questions that you have.
Great, thank you. This is John again. I'm going to talk a little bit about the instructional application of Telemetric. We separate feedback into particular domains of writing for a couple of reasons. One is that it's helpful for students to have discrete revision directives around things like organization, content and development, which most closely mimics the critical thinking aspect of writing, the language use and style, and the mechanics, and so on. And so those analytic rubrics are applied in such a way, not just to give a summative score of the writing, but to give a summative score of writing according to each particular domain or trait of writing, and then to apply specific revision directives that are adaptive. In other words, on a 6-point rubric, for example, if a student scores a 2.5, there are fundamental problems with the writing. And so the feedback tends to be structurally fundamental and basic. If a student is a 4.2 and is in the area of proficiency and progressing appropriately, the feedback will be more rigorous. Next slide, please. So some of the immediate feedback, it comes in two principal sources. The first is mechanical, grammatical, and so on. It will, provide a writing prompt. The student writing space below, as you can see, kind of mimics Microsoft Word. They can underline and colorize and that sort of thing, and organize their work in such a way that they would be familiar with in a program like Microsoft Word. But we'll be given feedback first of basically an editorial nature. Next slide. So you'll see that there are clause errors and capitalization errors, spelling errors, and so on, misused words and that sort of thing. And all that feedback, I'll get into that in a moment, can be provided in a variety of languages, 8 in all, to help ELL and ESL or ESOL student populations, kind of understand and apply that feedback. But next slide is where the real sort of heavy lifting comes in. This is an overall analysis according to, in this case, the organizational aspect of writing. So the revision goal, which can be rendered in Spanish, for example, will ask the student to consider what it means to write a good introduction, right? And at the end of that introduction, to include something that tells the reader what your essay will be about. What's the central controlling idea or thesis? And of course, if they don't have a thesis, to go get one. And we'll be given exemplars of how that looks and how that should be done. Next slide. So stylistic feedback is a bit different. Choose words carefully is the first revision directive, and there's usually several for each trait. But in this case, they're being told to choose words carefully, which seems like a very general sort of direction. But the reality is that they're being told something quite specific. Highlight the details that answer the questions who, what, when, where, and why. Underline words or phrases that you're repeating. A lot of developing writers have limited vocabularies, and so there are tools like word banks and synonym banks and transitional phrases they can use to connect their ideas and to introduce more precise language to convey what they mean. Next slide. And they're given that immediate score feedback for a reason. Like, one of the problems with writing is that not much writing actually gets assigned because it's very labor intensive for the teacher to evaluate it and grade it, as we all know. And they don't really get down into the craft of writing, the actual composition. And because it's again, the labor intensive nature of the grading and evaluation of it doesn't permit that. So students write something because it's due, at a certain date, and they submit it. Some of them write fairly well, more of them don't. And the teacher kind of lives with that reality. But we want to introduce immediate feedback so that they can become independent editors, independent agents. By the time a student gets a score back that's manual, they're usually onto something else, and they're not certainly being invited to revise it or improve it in any way. But this allows them to get into the actual craft of writing, which is draft, initial draft, second draft, immediate feedback, actionable revision directives. And it's through that recursive practice, that's how they become better. So that's what I mean by the instructional aspect and why those immediate scores help, because it's not just a grade per se. It really breaks down their writing, because some of them are going to be struggling in different areas. You might find some students who are technically fairly sound. Their punctuation and the periods are in the right places, the capitals and the spelling's okay, but you might find that their writing lacks coherence, lacks organization. And then conversely, you may find other students who seem to marshal a good argument, have understood the material, and can show evidence of that in their writing, but stylistically and grammatically, they need a lot of help. And those are very different areas to address. And teachers in subjects outside of English composition, particularly, aren't really in the business of, being English composition teachers. Even many English teachers, as good and effective as they are, don't have the time to, and the resources to address each student's individual learning gaps in this area. And that's where this AI really becomes the ultimate teacher's aid and writing coach for the student, and allows them to write and revise more frequently. Matt referred to it earlier. The frequency of writing is really key, but it's the immediate feedback that allows that to be productive, because just writing a lot more isn't necessarily going to make you better. It's having actionable feedback that you can put into a revision plan and do incremental revisions that address each of these domains of writing. Next slide. And I mentioned the multilingual feedback. Increasingly a lot of our students in higher ed and in K-12, and we have products that address that use Telemetric in all these areas. We don't score writing in Spanish, but it's sometimes helpful for them to have feedback in Spanish, for example. And in many cases, our multilingual students are more advanced in many ways because they've grown up with maybe a couple of languages at home. They're relatively fluent in 2 languages. Most American students only know English, right, to the extent that they do. But this is a very useful tool. Both grammatical feedback and mechanical feedback and revision feedback and directives can be rendered in their native language. Next slide. And to the best of my knowledge, I think we're the only company that's really taking all the data that comes out of writing. And it's not just score data, because you can relate it to usage data. How often are they writing? Where, in what particular domains of writing or areas do they need the most help? What are the most prevalent errors? And so a companion technology that we've introduced called WriteView really allows administration to see what the status of literacy as it relates to writing and the improvement thereof is in the district, right? Because the classroom application is such that the teachers know all this. They have a very robust reporting suite. They can see the particular areas of concern down to the individual student, down to the discrete domains of writing. But the administration doesn't always have access to this data. So we're taking a lot of the data that Telemetric Scoring produces and putting into a dashboard that's updated daily. So you have pretty much a real-time snapshot of how writing is progressing in your institution. Next slide.
So the huge lesson learned and takeaway from this for me as an assessment professional, as you all know, the communication and critical thinking are the 2 core objectives that are pretty much go across all of the courses that are a part of the Texas core curriculum. And for me, again, I am observing as an assessment professional that the scores of the faculty members on communication and critical thinking are very high at the score of 4, as opposed to the calibration. Not only that, but as a gateway course, the English 1301 and English 1302 had high failure rates at the course level. So our course success rate was much lower, yet the scores on the student work, the summative work at the end, was high. And so to me, there was a significant gap. And you can't really say that, right? You have to really do some digging, some research. And this is the reason why AI was so important to me, because transferring these literacy skills across the curriculum is what the general education is supposed to do. And if in English we're not able to do that and allow the student to have those high order thinking skills on the Bloom's taxonomy and demonstrate metacognition, which is what we're looking at for our QEP, then it's very difficult to say that the student is actually going to exit out of our programs and have that communication and critical thinking skills that they need as essential skills in the marketplace, in workforce. And so this is why this is very important to me to do with Vantage and Telemetric, and really determine where are the gaps. And so I can see the gaps, as you could see from the scores, the mean scores. And so this was important for me. We also want to ensure that the learning outcomes titles are consistent. So what do I mean by that is, although you have English 1301 as a course, when you get down to the individual faculty members, faculty were not actually titling their learning outcomes the same all the way through. And I believe as the three components of education are the course, the instructor, and the student, you have to isolate the course, or basically the curriculum, and the instructor, basically their pedagogy and the learning activities and assessment techniques that they use. You have to isolate those two in order to really determine whether the student is actually performing at a level that they are mastering the learning content. So you might have one English 1301 section taught by a faculty member, them actually scoring well, and you might have another scoring differently, but there was just no consistency. So it was very difficult for me to really determine how I could help the English faculty, the English department, be successful in improving student learning outcomes. And that is what we are supposed to be doing when it comes to assessment. It's all about assessing regularly, formative and summative, to determine, you know, how we can help the student perform. The other thing that was mentioned is drafts. There were very few faculty members that were using drafts to help the student to develop their learning on critical thinking, communication, actually even mastering the SLOs throughout the course. They were just giving them a midterm and they were giving them a final, which means that they really were not getting feedback to allow the student to operate at different levels of the Bloom's taxonomy in terms of introducing, developing, and then of course mastering the SLOs and also the content and the context in which they were writing. So again, all of this brought us to what we're doing now in the QEP, which is dealing with metacognition and really helping students to learn critical thinking first, and then rise up to the higher order thinking level, which is metacognition. And finally, I believe Matt already mentioned that we need to have that scoring distribution. So there really is going to be some time that I need to work with faculty to pull some student work that has been scored in such a way that I can actually give them a normal distribution so that we can actually get the AI to calibrate correctly. Turn it over.
Thank you, Dr. White-Gozweda. We really appreciate that summation. The reality is that the greater the scale, the more accurate this becomes. And so while this project was necessarily constrained and limited in some ways, it very much validates the efficacy of AI scoring. Now, the GMAC study that we talked about is available and really speaks to using expert human scoring as a benchmark, because GMAT, for example, doesn't just use Telemetric. It uses Telemetric as a sort of lodestar against which they apply human scoring. And when there is a discrepancy, they'll introduce another human scorer, for example, to achieve that scale and distribution. One of the things anecdotally that I found and that surprised me was that, you know, for the instructional application, that vocational technical schools were some of our biggest clients. And I didn't understand that at first. I thought, why would somebody studying culinary arts or cosmetology or mechanics or so on need to do this? This seemed like, to me, the provenance of, you know, ELA, English composition. But the reality was that they were, too many students were failing certification exams, and their teachers didn't really, you know, necessarily know where to intervene, what the students did or did not know at critical points in their study. And so we created writing prompts around their curricular material. And the students were asked to, you know, read and absorb and understand this and demonstrate their understanding through simple writing tasks. There's really only two ways to, you know, to show what you know, as they say, right? You can tell me or you can write it. And once they started having the students write to these topics, even though they were, you know, vocational per se, they started to see very clearly what the students knew, didn't know, where you know, the critical teacher intervention was required, and so on. So I hope the GMAC study will answer some of the questions about human versus AI scoring. But the one thing that's been proven with decision is that students who receive adaptive immediate feedback during the process of composition are able to see immediate and dramatic improvements in their writing. And that's just not humanly possible. And that's where AI really provides a critical service. A teacher with even say 30 students and spends 10 minutes grading each one of their essays is going to spend 5 hours doing that, and the student's going to get it back a bit later, and whether they're able to take those reflections and apply them to revision is questionable. The whole idea of this is to give them immediate actionable feedback that they can apply to their writing, and in doing so to become recursive cyclical editors of their own work. And I don't care what kind of skill you want to practice, but if you don't practice it, you will not get better at it, most likely. And this really allows students to engage in the craft of composition, because the feedback is so particular and so immediate and so adaptive to the level of their writing, right? The feedback's going to be more rigorous for more advanced writers, and it's going to be more fundamental for those with more basic sort of learning gaps. And that's where, from an instructional application point of view, it's been proven to be very useful over the last 20 years. But thank you, Dr. White. I really appreciate the opportunity to present this today.
Yes, and I would like to talk to the fact that we are also seeing that in some of our technical programs, the very fact that we have to use our English faculty to assist some of the students who are failing the exams, the third-party exams, and again, because we are predominantly a Hispanic serving population. Student population, this is occurring also in our school, in the health professions, and sometimes in the career technical courses such as automotive or something like that. So this again is a pilot. It to me is a very promising work. It really applies to what we're trying to do in terms of scale the students' abilities to use communication and critical thinking throughout the curriculum. The literacy needs to come across all programs and be transferred through within any context. And so this is important work right here for TSC to do. And I greatly appreciate Vantage working with me. Now, there are a couple of more questions here real quick. One of the questions is, can you provide examples of discourse level factors? A couple of words or a sentence should be exactly the same as the factors. I'm not sure what that means, discourse level factors. Maybe somebody else can speak to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you try to reframe that?
Yeah, Sarah, could you rephrase that question, and I'll move on to the next one. How many artifacts would it take to improve 1,000 or more? Well, I think that primarily what Matt and John both said was that even with me providing 1,000 essays, it's about normal distribution is one, and then number two, I believe that it's going to be more about the calibration scores at the institutional level being used as a model for AI as opposed to the faculty, because again, I've already mentioned that it appears that the faculty is scoring them higher. And when John said, it's difficult for them to take 10 minutes to score an essay, right? If they have 30 to 35 students, we don't know for sure, but are they scoring them high just to get through them? We really don't know. But that is the large gap that I am explaining is present between course success rate and then the scores on the actual student work that is summative work that this is basically their signature assignment and their capstone at the end. And one of the things that I would also mention is if you go and look at I-Say, which is my webinar that I did on April 21st, you will notice my conversation about how I have to change the didactic nature of assessment practices and dialogue at TSC, because even in using Bloom's taxonomy, you have different faculty members that align and appropriate the levels of Bloom's taxonomy differently to SLOs. So again, this is all about training and developing our faculty to be able to be educators and have that ability to actually score properly. And using those rubrics is how I started to change the didactic nature of dialogue here and assessment practices. But I even look deeper into the signature assignments and looking at how they explicitly inform the student what work they're supposed to be doing, how they're supposed to be demonstrating the core and the SLOs. And again, there was a lot of work that had to be done with the signature assignment design, the assessment design. So I'm looking at all of those things when I sit here and work with Vantage. 10% sample for calibration. Yes, that's what we use. 10% of the entire student population for the fall semester student work, and so we would end up doing about 400 pieces of work each semester for English 1301 and about 300 or so for English 1302. Okay. Unless there's any other questions, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone. Thank you, John and Matt, for working with me. We will continue to work together. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Roberts if he's available to take over.
Dr. White-Grisweta, thank you so much for this. You talked a lot about scale. You talked a lot about getting students into the recursive practice of writing. And what's interesting is how broadly applicable it is. One of the things you said was preparing them for the career marketplace, right? One of the things employers consistently cite is the dearth of effective writing communication skills in candidates. And one of the things, I went through an initial slide talking about how, GMAT works with us or the iPhone or any of those things, and that's all well and good. But Amazon is actually a client. They use Telemetric to evaluate the communication skills of their management candidates, and the United Nations uses Telemetric for the very same reason, to understand better if their potential employees, if you are effective writers.
Yes, excellent. Thank you so much. If anybody would like to reach out to either one of us, there's our information there for email or telephone number.
Dr. White, can you include or attach the GMAC study I sent you so that everyone can have that if they're interested in?
It's going to be attached to the LEAP website, so they'll have the PowerPoint presentation and the study.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for the time.
Thanks everybody. Appreciate your time.
All right.